Welcome to our deep dive series on the French and Indian War. We are jumping right into what many historians call the pivotal year of the entire conflict in North America, 1758.
It really is the turning point. I mean, for years before this, it's just been one British disaster after another. You have Monongahela, you have Oswego, Fort William Henry. It's a real catalog of failures.
Humiliating defeats. But in 1758, something shifts. The entire momentum of the war just seems to reverse.
It does, and it's because of new leadership, a completely new strategy, and this incredible mobilization of colonial power. This is the year that the Anglo-American war machine finally, clicks into gear.
And today our mission is to focus on two campaigns from that year that are, well, they're completely interconnected and they strike right at the heart of New France's ability to even wage war.
Exactly. We're talking about the incredibly bold raid on Fort Frontenac and the huge, long-awaited expedition to finally capture Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio.
These aren't just stories about battles. They're about logistics. They're about diplomacy and some pretty dramatic failures, too.
Oh, absolutely. We'll be looking at the grand strategy from William Pitt in London, how that translated on the ground, and then these catastrophic logistical problems the French were facing, and maybe most importantly, the diplomatic game being played with the Native American nations.
Okay, so let's unpack this. When you say 1758, you're really saying William Pitt. He's the new power in London, basically running the war effort.
He is. And he comes in after years of failure under generals like Loudon, and he has a totally radical new vision. He looks at the colonies not as a resource to be squeezed, but as partners.
And his big idea is essentially, we'll provide the money, you provide the men.
That's the core of it. And that financial commitment was like a political lightning bolt. It just fostered this incredible, almost overnight wave of colonial support.
You have to remember the context here, right? The colonies felt like they'd been burned so many times before.
Repeatedly, especially in places like Massachusetts and New York. They'd raise troops, they'd spend enormous sums from their own treasuries for previous campaigns, and then the reimbursements from Parliament would be slow or incomplete or just never come.
So there was this deep well of political mistrust. That was the real obstacle.
It was the primary roadblock. So when Pitt comes in, he's not just offering money, he's offering certainty. He offers parliamentary reimbursement, and he frames it very cleverly as free gifts from the crown.
Free gifts.
Yes, covering all the major expenses, raising the troops, clothing them, paying them. It was the guarantee the colonial assemblies needed to hear. It meant they could go all in without bankrupting themselves for a war being run by, what they saw as arrogant British generals.
And the response was just immediate. The numbers are staggering.
They're just incredible. As soon as the news of Pitt's policies arrives, the continental colonies commit to putting more than 23,000 provincial soldiers under arms.
23,000.
I mean, think about the individual colonies. Connecticut, which was always a pretty reliable source of manpower, they raised 5,000 men.
Wow.
Massachusetts commits over 2,000. New York, which had been notoriously difficult about things like quartering British troops, they suddenly raise almost 2,700 men.
And it wasn't just the big northern colonies. This enthusiasm went down the whole coast.
It did. Virginia is a crucial one for our story today. They doubled their military establishment and offered up 2 full regiments for the expedition against Fort Duquesne.
Which is a huge commitment.
A huge commitment. And beyond just men, they start solving all these long-standing problems. The quartering controversies that drove General Loudon crazy. The colonies just start building barracks at public expense. They're funding firewood and salt and all these incidentals through their own legislatures.
So that number, 23,000 provincials.
Yeah.
It's more than just a number. It represents an unprecedented level of coordinated effort.
It really does. It shows that when the Crown treated the colonies like, genuine partners deserving of respect and reimbursement, they responded with this massive wave of enthusiasm and sacrifice.
And you have to think about the long-term impact of that. Tens of thousands of young American men serving together, fighting alongside British regulars.
Exactly. Sharing that experience, the discipline, the combat, the sheer boredom of camp life, that's going to forge a kind of shared identity that will become incredibly important a generation later.
So Pitt has the men. He has the money. And he backs it up with this very detailed three-pronged campaign plan for 1758.
A triple campaign, yeah.
Yeah.
The goal was to hit New France on multiple fronts at the same time, so they couldn't just shuttle their limited forces from one crisis to the next, which is what they had done pretty successfully in previous years.
So what were the three main targets?
Okay, so first you have General Geoffrey Amherst leading a massive amphibious assault on the fortress of Louisbourg. That's the gateway to the St. Lawrence.
The big one.
The big one. Second, General Abercrombie is supposed to push up Lake Champlain and take Fort Carillon, which we know as Ticonderoga.
Which doesn't go so well, but that's a story for another time.
A disaster, yes. But the third prong, and the one we're focusing on, is the major overland expedition against Fort Duquesne, led by a Scottish general named John Forbes.
Right. And to understand why this triple attack was so dangerous for the French, we have to look at their internal situation.
Yep.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, why was New France so fragile in 1758?
Their entire position was, well, it was fundamentally doomed by logistics and politics. The logistical problem was just catastrophic.
Famine.
Actual famine. New France suffered devastating crop failures in both 1756 and 1757. So by the start of 1758, they are on the brink of mass starvation.
This isn't just, tight rations for the soldiers. This is a society-wide crisis.
It's an all-encompassing catastrophe. The records are shocking. We have reports from January 1758 that a minnow of wheat, that's about 3 bushels, costs 15 livres.
And what would that normally be?
Normally 4 or 5 livres, so a 3 or 4-fold price increase, and that's if you could even find it. They'd been mixing flour with peas since 56 just to stretch the supply.
I can't imagine the effect on morale.
Devastating. By April, the daily bread ration in Quebec City itself was down to 2 ounces per person.
2 ounces, that's nothing.
It's barely subsistence. There are reports of people in the countryside literally eating grass and wild greens to survive. So your soldiers are weak, they're suffering from scurvy, they're malnourished, they can't fight effectively.
So the entire French war effort is basically hanging by a thread, just waiting for ships from France.
Precisely. And a convoy does arrive on May 22nd, which averts the worst of the starvation in Quebec. But the food reserves are still dangerously low across the entire colony.
And you said there was a political problem, too?
The huge one. The toxic relationship between the two men at the top. General Montcalm, the commander of the French regulars, and the Governor-General, Vaudreuil.
This has been a running theme, their rivalry. But it gets really bad in 58.
It's worse than ever. They're barely on speaking terms, just trading these scathing letters full of mutual contempt. Montcalm thinks Vaudreuil is an incompetent colonial administrator, and Vaudreuil thinks Montcalm is an arrogant European who despises Canadians.
And it wasn't just a personality clash. They had fundamentally different ideas about how to even fight the war.
A complete strategic division. Montcalm is a traditional European officer. He believes in set-piece battles, sieges, defending fortresses. He looks down on the wilderness fighting style.
The petite guerre.
Yes, the petite guerre, or little war, what we would call irregular or guerrilla warfare. It relies on speed, surprise, raids, and most critically, on the skills and participation of Native American allies.
And that was Vaudreuil's whole strategy.
It was. As a Canadian-born aristocrat, he believed it was the only way for a small French population to defend a vast territory. Montcalm, on the other hand, thought it was barbaric and undisciplined. He couldn't stand it.
So when the supply crisis hits, they just blame each other.
They do. Montcalm accuses Vaudreuil of mismanaging the colony's food. Vaudreuil accuses Montcalm of disdaining the very Canadian and Native allies they needed to survive. This complete lack of a unified command, right at the moment the British are launching a 3-pronged invasion. It's a recipe for disaster.
It sets the perfect stage for someone to take advantage of that chaos. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Bradstreet's raid on Fort Frontenac.
Yes, and the brilliant thing about this raid is that it wasn't even one of Pitt's main objectives. The big shows were supposed to be Louisbourg and Ticonderoga. This was more of an opportunistic sideshow.
But it turns out to be this strategic masterstroke.
It really does. It targets the logistical jugular of New France, and it works because it exploits the French failure of imagination. They're so focused on the front doors, the St. Lawrence and Lake Champlain, that they've completely neglected the back door.
And Colonel John Bradstreet is the one who sees that opening.
He does. He's a very resourceful officer, and he realizes that the vital supply artery on Lake Ontario is going to be wide open.
So tell us about the expedition. He gathers this force, mostly provincials.
Almost entirely. He has about 3,100 men, and the vast majority are provincials from New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. They set out from the Mohawk River Valley and head for the Oneida carrying place.
that difficult portage between the river system and Lake Ontario.
Notoriously difficult. It's a logistical nightmare. But they get through it, and they reach the shore of Lake Ontario on August 21st, 1758.
And they stop at a very symbolic spot.
They do. They make camp for a night at the ruins of Fort Oswego, which the French, under Montcalm, had captured and destroyed just 2 years earlier. The sources say there was scarce the appearance of there ever having been a fort.
So they're literally launching their attack from the ashes of a past defeat. That must have been a powerful motivator.
I think so. From there, they push on to Tackett's Harbor to organize for the final attack run across the lake.
And then talk about the target, Fort Frontenac. Geographically, why is this place so vital?
Frontenac, which is modern-day Kingston, Ontario, sits at the perfect choke point. It's right where Lake Ontario flows into the St. Lawrence River.
So everything going in or out has to pass it.
Everything. It was the central warehouse, the main supply depot for the entire French interior, for their whole empire in the West.
The Pays d'Ono. Let's break that down. What does that term really encompass?
Pays d'Ono, the upper country, is this vast network of forts and trading posts stretching all through the Great Lakes, down into the Ohio Valley, even towards the Mississippi. Places like Fort Detroit, Fort Michilimackinac, and, crucially for our story, Fort Duquesne.
And all of them depended on Frontenac.
Completely. Every bullet, every barrel of flour, every blanket, every trade good that the French used to maintain their garrisons and, more importantly, to maintain their alliances with the native nations. It all had to pass through the warehouses at Fort Frontenac.
So cutting that line would be devastating. But getting there was the hard part. The biggest threat wasn't the fort itself, but the journey across the lake.
The risk was immense. The French had naval superiority on Lake Ontario. They had a small fleet of armed schooners and sloops that carried enough cannon to blow Bradstreet's entire force out of the water.
And his men were just an open bateau.
Exactly. Small, open boats. If they were spotted by the French fleet in the middle of the lake, they would have been annihilated. There would have been nowhere to run.
And yet, they made it. How did they achieve such complete surprise?
It really comes down to French complacency. Vaudreuil and the high command in Quebec were just so fixated on Louisbourg and Ticonderoga that they didn't think the British had the capacity to also launch an offensive on Lake Ontario.
They left the back door unlocked.
Our sources say they were almost totally unprepared and had left it standing wide open. Bradstreet's force paddles for 3 days from Tackett's Harbor to Frontenac, and not a single French sail appears on the horizon. It's miraculous.
So they land, undetected, on the afternoon of August 25th. Less than a mile from the fort.
And the raid itself is over very quickly. It's a 2-day affair. The next morning, they start hauling their artillery ashore and dragging it into position. The French resistance is minimal, just some random, ineffectual cannon shots.
Why was the fort so weak?
It was critically undermanned. The garrison had been bled dry to send reinforcements to defend the St. Lawrence Valley. The commander, an elderly officer named de Noyon, had only about 100 soldiers and militia. He knew he stood no chance against 3,000 men.
Now, there's a fascinating little anecdote here about Bradstreet's Iroquois allies that tells you so much about the realities of frontier warfare.
It's a great story. So Bradstreet had recruited some Onondaga and Oneida warriors from the Iroquois Confederacy to come with him. But as soon as they arrive and see what the target is, they desert.
They just leave at the very moment of victory.
They just pack up and go home because they realize that Fort Frontenac isn't just a military base, it's a major trading post where they do business. Their economic relationship with the French at that specific post was more important to them than their military alliance with the British. They weren't about to help destroy one of their key suppliers. It shows you how complex these loyalties really were.
It's all about interests, not just grand alliances. But their departure didn't really matter in the end.
No, because the real prize wasn't the fort's tiny garrison. It was what was inside the warehouses.
And what did they find?
They found a treasure trove. The warehouses were, and this is a quote, bursting with military supplies destined for the Ohio country and trade goods and peltry from the whole Pays d'Ono.
Just an unbelievable amount of stuff.
Tens of thousands of pounds of flour, hundreds of barrels of pork, cannons, mortars, muskets, ammunition, blankets, everything you need to supply an army and an alliance network for a year.
And the furs. That must have been a huge financial loss for the French.
A massive loss. This was the peltry collected from the entire Great Lakes region, all waiting to be shipped to Montreal and then on to France. But as valuable as the loot was, the strategic impact was even greater.
Which was what?
Bradstreet captured and brunned the entire French fleet on Lake Ontario. 9 armed vessels. He effectively destroyed French naval power on the lake in one fell swoop.
So he takes what he can carry, burns the rest, and destroys the ships.
Exactly. And the single most important consequence of all of this was the total severing of the supply route to the west, specifically to Fort Duquesne.
So this action at Frontenac in August directly seals the fate of Fort Duquesne in November.
That is the critical connection. Vaudreuil himself wrote that it was a grievous disaster. He admitted they had lost control of Lake Ontario and that there was now no way to send emergency supplies to the Ohio garrisons that were already, on the verge of starvation because of the famine.
And Bradstreet, having done all this, just slips away.
Gets his men back in the boats and retreats before any French relief force can even be organized to intercept him. It was a perfect raid.
So with that logistical artery severed, the focus now shifts to that big overland push from the east. General Forbes and the road to Duquesne.
Right. And this campaign was so important psychologically. It wasn't just about taking territory. It was about avenging Braddock's defeat from 1755.
Wiping that stain from British honor. But Forbes's mission is complicated from the very start by this huge political argument, the route controversy.
It's a fascinating clash of geography, military strategy, and raw economic self-interest. Forbes has to decide which path to take to get his army of thousands across the Appalachian Mountains.
Well, he chooses to build a brand new road, straight west across Pennsylvania, instead of reusing the road Braddock had built from Virginia.
And this decision was intensely political. You had what was called the Virginia Party, and this included a young George Washington, who was a colonel in the Virginia Regiment, and speculators from the Ohio Company.
They had a lot of money tied up in that southern route.
A huge amount. They had invested in the land, the infrastructure. They desperately wanted Forbes to use Braddock's road because it would solidify Virginia's claim to the Ohio Forks and make their land holdings incredibly valuable.
So when Forbes picks the Pennsylvania route, they are furious.
Furious. They do everything they can to undermine the decision, predicting disaster, highlighting every delay, every accident. Forbes is essentially fighting a political battle with his own allies before he even sees a single French soldier.
And building this road must have been an incredible undertaking.
It was a monumental feat of military engineering, and it was mostly supervised by Forbes's second-in-command, a Swiss officer named Henry Bouquet. He was meticulous, and he had to be.
Can you give us a sense of what's involved? It's not just clearing a path.
No, you're building a highway capable of supporting hundreds of heavy wagons. You're cutting a road 12 feet wide through dense, old-growth forest. You're leveling hillsides, building bridges over creeks and ravines, all while on constant alert for enemy raids. It was slow, back-breaking work.
And Bouquet is under all this pressure from the Virginians.
Constant pressure. The sources say he knew that the Virginia Party would use any accident on the new route to answer their outcries convincingly. So every step had to be perfect, every bridge secure. The whole army moved forward like a giant fortified construction crew.
But even with all that caution, the campaign suffers this shocking setback. Major Grant's disaster, it sounds like Braddock all over again.
It was a moment of pure recklessness that nearly wrecked the whole thing. Forbes was very sick at this point, bedridden, and he had given strict orders. Be cautious. Don't take any unnecessary risks.
And Major James Grant just ignores that.
He convinces Bouquet to let him take an 800-man reconnaissance force out ahead of the main army from their forward base at Loyalhanna all the way to Fort Duquesne.
What was he trying to do?
He was arrogant. He thought he could maybe stage a quick raid, capture some prisoners, maybe even intimidate the French garrison into surrendering. He completely underestimated his enemy.
He literally marches up to the fort and tries to bait them out.
Yes. On the night of September 13th, he has his drummers beat the reveille, this noisy military call, basically announcing his presence and daring the French to come out and fight. It was an act of incredible hubris in the middle of the wilderness.
And the French and their native allies were more than happy to oblige.
They were. The next morning, a large, well-organized force swarmed out of the fort and completely surrounded Grant's detachment. It was a disaster.
A small-scale reprise of Braddock's defeat.
That's the perfect description. About a third of Grant's force was killed, wounded, or captured. The rest were routed and fled in chaos back toward the main army. Grant himself was taken prisoner and shipped off to Canada.
That must have been a crushing blow to morale, especially for Forbes, who's already so ill.
A huge psychological blow. It was a bloody reminder that the French and their allies were still incredibly dangerous in this kind of woodland fighting. But unlike Braddock's defeat, it didn't stop the main army. Bouquet held things together, and the slow, deliberate advance continued. But the final victory? That would be won by diplomats, not soldiers.
So what does this all mean? We have the French supply line cut at Frontenac, and we have Forbes's army grinding its way west. But the fort doesn't fall to a big climactic battle.
No, it falls because of a perfect storm. It's a combination of that logistical collapse we talked about and some brilliant diplomatic maneuvering that happens completely off the battlefield.
The Treaty of Easton.
Exactly. This treaty, negotiated in Easton, Pennsylvania in October 1758, was the diplomatic key that unlocked the Ohio Valley for the British.
And it was all about peeling the French's crucial native allies away from them, specifically the Delawares and the other Ohio nations.
Right. These were the very warriors who had destroyed Braddock's army. And the negotiations were incredibly delicate because you had to balance the interests of the local Ohio Indians who actually lived on the land with the claims of their supposed overlords, the Iroquois Confederacy.
A classic political tightrope. The Ohio Indians are worried about losing their land to British settlers.
That's their number one concern. So how did the British promise them security without angering the powerful Iroquois, who they also need as ally?
How do they pull it off?
It was a diplomatic masterpiece. They basically came up with a two-part solution. First, they publicly reaffirmed the Iroquois' historic claim to the Ohio lands. This satisfied Iroquois pride and their sense of status.
Okay, so that keeps the Iroquois happy.
But then, and this is the crucial part for the Delawares, they also granted the Ohio Indians the right to negotiate directly with Pennsylvania over future land sales and settlements.
Ah, so it preserves the Iroquois' formal authority, but gives the Ohio Indians actual practical power over their own land.
Precisely. It preserved the form of Iroquois dominance while completely undercutting the substance of their control. And on top of that, Pennsylvania, with help from Quaker groups, promised to set aside a permanent, protected settlement for the Delawares in the Wyoming Valley.
And that did the trick.
It was a masterstroke. It removed the primary motivation for the Ohio Indians to keep fighting for the French. At the most critical moment, their military support for Fort Duquesne just evaporated.
So while the British are shoring up their diplomatic flank, the French commander at Duquesne, Lignery, is feeling the vice tighten.
Tighter and tighter. The impact of Bradstreet's raid is now being felt in real time. The promised emergency food supplies from Frontenac are never going to arrive.
So he's got a starving garrison, and now no allies.
It's an impossible situation. By mid-October, he's actually sending away the few remaining local Indians because he literally cannot feed them. His own garrison is down to about 300 men, and a third of them are sick.
Incapable of fighting a real battle or withstanding a siege.
Completely. And then his last few local scouts, who are likely influenced by the news from the Treaty of Easton, they just disappear. They melt back into the forest, probably because they see this massive British army coming and decide it's not a fight worth dying in.
The final collapse comes quickly.
Very quickly. On November 23rd, French scouts report back with the definitive news. Forbes's army, slow but unstoppable, is now just 15 miles away.
Lignery has to know it's over. There's no repeating the victory over Braddock.
It's impossible. He makes the only rational decision he can, abandon the fort. His priority now is just to save his men and deny the British the prize.
So he sends what he can downriver.
Yes, he puts his cannons and any valuable portable supplies on boats and sends them down the Ohio River toward the French posts in the Illinois country.
And for what's left, it's scorched earth.
Total destruction. His men spend their last hours setting explosives and flammable materials throughout the barracks, the storehouses, the wooden stockade walls. Their goal is to leave nothing but a pile of smoldering rubble for the British.
And then they just row away.
They get in their remaining boats and paddle up the Allegheny River, retreating north toward Fort Machault. They leave behind the ruins of the strategic prize they had held for 4 years.
So the British Army arrives on November 25th to find nothing. No battle, no siege, just the smoking remains of the fort.
The sense of anticlimax, but also immense relief, must have been incredible. The great campaign to avenge Braddock ended without a single shot being fired in a major battle.
And General Forbes, who was the architect of this victory, was so sick he had to be carried into the ruins on a litter.
He was dying. But even in that state, his mind was sharp, and he understood the complexities of the frontier better than most.
He left a very specific warning for his superiors.
He did. In one of his last letters to the new commander-in-chief, Amherst, he wrote this incredibly prescient line. He said, "I beg in the meantime that you will not think triflingly of the Indians or their friendship, when I venture to assure you that 20 Indians are capable of laying half this province waste.
A warning not to get complacent.
Yeah.
Just because you've taken the fort doesn't mean you've won the peace.
Exactly. He knew that the war in the West was a war of relationships and diplomacy, and that it would require constant attention. And of course, the site of the ruined fort was immediately secured and renamed Pittsburgh, in honor of William Pitt.
So when you pull back, 1758 really was the great pivot point of the war. Bradstreet's raid at Frontenac cripples French logistics in the West.
Which then directly leads to the starvation and abandonment of Fort Duquesne. That, combined with the diplomatic victory at Easton, just completely unravels the French position in the Ohio Valley.
Two very different kinds of victories. One is a swift, daring military raid. The other is a slow, patient, grinding logistical and diplomatic success.
And together they proved that Pitt's grand strategy could work. Mobilizing that colonial manpower and backing it with the full financial power of the crown was the key.
And that massive colonial effort, those 23,000 men we talked about, that experience of serving together, of winning major victories alongside the British regulars, must have changed how they saw themselves.
It had to. It built a sense of competence, of shared purpose, and it fundamentally altered their perception of their role within the British Empire.
Which leads to a final provocative thought for you to think about. This whole wave of cooperation and sacrifice was built on a promise from London. The promise of respect, of partnership, and full financial reimbursement.
A promise made in the desperation of wartime. But what happens when the war is over? When the existential threat is gone and London starts looking at the enormous bills and decides it wants more control, not less.
The very success of 1758 sets this new, high expectation among the colonies for autonomy and partnership, an expectation that the empire might not be willing or even able to meet once the peace is signed.
And the clash between that expectation and the post-war reality is, well, that's the road to another war entirely.
A powerful thought to end on. Our next deep dive will move into 1759, what's often called the Year of Miracles for the British. It's the year of the true climax of the war.
We'll see monumental actions at Fort Niagara and, of course, the epic battle on the Plains of Abraham for the city of Quebec itself. Join us as we look at the year that truly sealed the fate of New France.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the decisive Western campaigns of 1758. We appreciate you listening.